Grant Mercer came home after 3 weeks on the road and found 11 white storage pods sitting across his hayfield like a private warehouse nobody had bothered to ask permission for. HOA President Vanessa Crowley was already there, clipboard in hand, telling workers his land was temporary community overflow. Grant said nothing. He photographed every pod, every tire track, every delivery tag, then pulled the deed from his safe. By sunset, Vanessa was demanding access to the containers. By morning, Grant finally knew why. The HOA had stored its records, equipment, contracts, and secrets on land it had never owned. If you think Karen picked the wrong hayfield, stay until Grant opens the document she never expected him to find. Grant Mercer had been gone 3 weeks driving north to check on a leased parcel. His family had worked for 2 generations, sleeping in motels along the highway, and calling the farm every evening out of habit more than worry. The drive home had been long and uneventful, the kind of quiet stretch of road that let a man think about nothing more complicated than the price of diesel, and whether the hay would be ready to cut by the time he pulled back into the driveway. He had not expected trouble. The Mercer land had sat undisturbed for generations, its boundaries settled long before the subdivision across the road ever broke ground, and Grant had never once had reason to think twice about leaving it unattended for a few weeks at a time. That confidence evaporated the moment his truck crested the last hill before the farmhouse. The first thing that stopped him was not a broken fence or crushed grass. It was 11 massive white storage pods lined up in 2 neat rows in the middle of his hayfield, as if someone had decided his land made a convenient warehouse. Several of the containers were labeled in block letters: HOA records, clubhouse furniture, maintenance equipment, financial archive, security systems, annual meeting materials. Grant did not shout. He climbed out of the truck, slowly pulled out his phone, and began recording everything he saw, starting with the tire ruts cut nearly a foot deep into the field he had just spent a season leveling. A section of his own fence had been taken down entirely to let the delivery trucks through. At the far end of the field stood Vanessa Crowley, the HOA president, flanked by 2 maintenance workers, watching him approach with no trace of apology on her face. Her first words were not an explanation but an announcement that they had finally needed somewhere temporary to store community property, and that his return was convenient timing. Grant asked her only one question: who had given her permission to cross his fence, and Vanessa laughed as though the question itself were absurd. She told him the HOA held a community access easement over the property and could use the pasture whenever necessary, and Grant knew immediately that this could not be true, because the Mercer farm had existed decades before the subdivision beside it was ever platted. Grant did not argue with her in the field. He simply photographed every delivery tag on every container, and one detail on the paperwork caught his attention instantly: delivery location authorized by Vanessa Crowley, her own signature at the bottom of every ticket. He told her plainly not to move anything yet, and Vanessa mistook his calm for surrender, turning away with a satisfied smile, as if the matter were already settled in her favor. But Grant was studying something she had not thought to check: the GPS coordinates stamped on each delivery slip, and what they showed made his stomach tighten in a way that had nothing to do with anger. All 11 pods had been placed nearly 600 feet past the edge of any land the HOA could plausibly claim. They were not sitting in some gray zone near a shared boundary. They were sitting dead center on Grant's recorded property. That night, back in the farmhouse, Grant opened the old family safe and pulled out a thick folder stamped by the county recorder decades earlier, a document he had seen only a handful of times in his life. On the very first page, a single line jumped out at him in plain-typed letters, one that made him almost smile despite the fury simmering underneath: no HOA easement reserved. The next morning, Vanessa returned, this time carrying a folded printout she called the HOA property map. A blue line ran across the edge of the Mercer land with a small label beside it reading Community Utility and Maintenance Corridor, and she tapped it firmly as though the ink alone settled the argument. Grant looked at the page for a long moment before asking where the recording number was, and Vanessa had no answer. He asked for the book and page reference that would tie the map to an actual filed survey, and again there was nothing but silence because the document in her hand was not an official survey at all. It was an internal sketch the HOA had drawn for itself, never filed, never reviewed by a court or a county office, carrying no legal weight whatsoever. Grant called Elliot Boone, an independent surveyor he trusted, and asked him to come out that afternoon with his equipment. Elliot had worked on the Mercer property before years earlier when Grant's father was still alive and wanted the eastern boundary remarked after a wildfire burned through the old fence posts, and he arrived within the hour, carrying the same battered case of instruments he always used. He walked the field slowly, checking each iron monument against the county's recorded coordinates, occasionally crouching to brush dirt away from a marker that had sunk half out of sight over the decades. Grant followed a few steps behind, saying little, letting Elliot work without interruption the way a man lets a doctor finish an examination before asking for the diagnosis. Elliot checked the old boundary monuments, cross-referenced GPS coordinates, and pulled county records straight from his truck laptop. And what he found was worse for Vanessa than either of them had expected. Not only did all 11 storage pods sit entirely inside Grant's deed, the dirt access road the delivery trucks had used to haul them in also crossed land that belonged to Grant alone. The HOA owned none of it, not the container site, not the access route, not the gate, and certainly not any easement that could justify hauling storage units onto private farmland. Elliot drove fresh survey stakes into the ground to mark the confirmed boundary, and Vanessa's reaction told Grant everything he needed to know about how far she was willing to go. She ordered 2 of the stakes pulled from the ground right in front of him in full view of Grant's camera without a flicker of hesitation. Grant did not physically stop her. He simply said mildly that she probably should not have done that on camera, and Vanessa spun the moment around instantly, accusing Grant of harassing the HOA before storming off toward her car. Later that day, she made the mistake that would define the entire case, sending an official email to the board stating flatly that the HOA would continue using the field regardless of the owner's objection. Grant forwarded the message straight to his attorney, Dana Whitaker, without a single added comment. Dana's reply arrived within the hour and contained a single word: perfect, because Vanessa had just turned what could have been dismissed as an honest delivery mix-up into written proof that she knew the owner objected and chose to proceed anyway. Dana asked Grant what exactly was inside those 11 pods, and Grant admitted he genuinely did not know. She scanned back through the delivery labels one more time, then looked up at him with the faint sharpening focus of someone who has just realized a case is about to get much larger. Colton promised to send over a formal statement from the company confirming the discrepancy between what Vanessa had claimed and what the paperwork actually showed, and he mentioned almost as an afterthought that his drivers had noted how unusual the request had felt from the start. Most HOA storage jobs, he explained, came with a site survey or at least a copy of a recorded plat attached to the work order, since companies preferred not to get caught in the middle of a property dispute. This one had come through with nothing but Vanessa's signature, and a verbal assurance that everything was cleared, which Colton admitted in hindsight should have raised a flag on his end as well. Grant thanked him for his honesty and told him the company would not be blamed for trusting a signature from someone who was supposed to know better. That single admission would later matter far more than either of them realized. Once the dispute reached the point where blame needed to be assigned precisely, Grant made no attempt to force any of the locks. He did not touch a single item inside the containers, did not sell anything, did not so much as slide a latch open out of curiosity. Instead, he chose the one move that would actually hurt Vanessa, cutting off the casual access she had assumed would always be there, repairing the section of fence that had been torn down and locking the gate behind it. A new sign went up at the entrance reading "Private Property Access by Owner Authorization Only," while the 11 pods remained exactly where the trucks had left them, untouched and unopened. Vanessa called him almost immediately, insisting the HOA needed certain records back before the annual meeting, her voice sharp with the assumption that urgency alone would make Grant open the gate. Grant stayed calm and told her to send the removal company and have the HOA's attorney contact his, so they could arrange lawful access properly. What he did not say out loud, though, Dana would say it for him later, was that involving the HOA's own attorney meant someone besides Vanessa would finally have to look at the deed, something she clearly did not want the board to see. She showed up at the gate the next day with 4 maintenance workers demanding Grant unlock it on the spot, and he refused, just as calmly as before. One of the workers, clearly uncomfortable with the whole scene, quietly asked Grant if there was somewhere nearby he could set down the toolbox he had been carrying, and Grant pointed him toward a shaded spot outside the fence line, unwilling to let his frustration with Vanessa spill onto men who were simply doing a job they had been assigned. Vanessa stood at the locked gate for several minutes, arguing that the community could not function without access to its own records, as though Grant were the one who had misplaced them rather than the one whose land had been used without consent. He reminded her evenly that nothing prevented the HOA from retrieving its property through proper channels, and that the only thing standing between her and those records was her own refusal to involve an attorney who might ask questions she did not want answered. Not long after Colton Price, the regional manager of the storage transport company, called Grant directly with a question of his own. He explained that Vanessa had told his dispatch team the delivery site was HOA-controlled overflow property, and Grant asked flatly whether the company had ever received any actual proof of that ownership. There was none, only the authorization form Vanessa herself had signed, which Colton agreed to send over without hesitation once he realized how serious the discrepancy was. Grant now had a delivery authorization bearing Vanessa's signature GPS coordinates, proving the containers sat squarely on his deed photographs of the torn fence, a full survey report, and a written email admitting the HOA intended to keep using the land despite his objection. But the real turn came when Colton began reading through the insurance manifest the HOA had filed to cover the shipment, a list far longer and stranger than either man expected. It was not a handful of folding chairs and a lawnmower. It was nearly the entire physical operating structure of the HOA gathered together while the clubhouse underwent renovations, sitting in a field that had never legally belonged to the association. Financial archives signed board minutes, vendor contracts, voting equipment, reserve account documents, landscaping machinery, security servers, gate control hardware, insurance files, and architectural records were all listed container by container like an inventory of everything Vanessa Crowley had ever controlled. Without meaning to, she had gathered the entire brain of the HOA into one place and set it down on land she did not own. Colton paused when he reached the description for the 9th container, and Grant asked what he had found. Colton read the lines slowly, original development plats and incorporation records, and Grant felt the shape of the whole dispute shift under his feet. Somewhere inside that pod sat the very documents that could prove, in the HOA's own words, exactly where its authority began and ended. And Vanessa had unknowingly delivered them straight onto the property whose boundary they were about to settle. Within days, Vanessa's tone changed completely, the threats replaced by an offer of $500 to make the whole misunderstanding disappear. Grant declined, and she raised the number to $2,000, then $5,000, growing visibly more anxious with each refusal. Grant finally asked her directly why pod number 9 had suddenly become worth $5,000 to her, and Vanessa's silence answered the question far more clearly than any words could have. It was not the sofas or the mowers she was afraid of losing. It was the paperwork, and she knew exactly which box it was sitting in. Grant, for his part, refused every offer without raising his voice, telling Vanessa plainly that this had stopped being about money the moment she tried to buy her way out of a single labeled container. Each refusal seemed to rattle her more than the last, and by the third call her tone had shifted from irritation to something closer to fear, though she was careful never to let that fear surface as an admission. Dana advised Grant to keep every conversation in writing from that point forward, so nothing could later be twisted into a verbal agreement or a misremembered concession. He complied, answering every call with a follow-up email summarizing exactly what had been said, a habit that would prove invaluable once the dispute moved into a more formal setting. While Vanessa scrambled, Dana filed a formal request to preserve every document connected to the boundary dispute, a legal hold meaning nothing could be destroyed, altered, or quietly misplaced. Vanessa's panic deepened at the next closed board session when Treasurer Mara Kincaid asked pointedly why the HOA had paid to place storage containers on land it did not own. Vanessa accused Grant of trying to blackmail the community, but when Mara asked to see the easement that supposedly authorized the whole arrangement, Vanessa refused to produce it, and the first real cracks in the board's unity began to show. Shortly afterward, Vanessa sent a community-wide notice claiming Grant had seized HOA property, a version of events he answered with nothing louder than documented fact. Dana sent the HOA's own attorney a complete packet, the certified deed, the recorded survey, the delivery contract, bearing Vanessa's signature, the written objection Grant had sent, and photographs of the dismantled fence. The response came back almost immediately, and it did not defend Vanessa in any way. The attorney instructed her to halt all access to the field until an internal review could be completed, and Grant understood the message beneath the formal language instantly. Vanessa had just lost the legal cover of her own organization. Not long afterward, Mara reached out to Dana privately admitting that Vanessa had known from the start that the field was never HOA property. When Dana asked where the proof was, Mara answered simply that it was sitting inside pod number 9, the same container that had made Vanessa suddenly desperate to pay her way out of the dispute. Neither Grant nor Vanessa opened the 9th pod alone. Both attorneys agreed the container should be unsealed, with witnesses present a representative from the storage company on hand, and a formal inventory log running the entire time. Vanessa tried to delay the process for nearly a week, but the board overruled her and the pod was finally opened in front of everyone involved. Inside sat dozens of file boxes, and near the front, a folder labeled Mercer West Boundary Development Exclusion, its edges worn soft with age. The storage company representative logged each box as it came out, reading its label aloud for the record, while a second witness photographed the contents before anyone touched them. Vanessa stood near the back of the small crowd with her arms crossed, watching the process with the stiff posture of someone who already suspected what was coming, but had run out of ways to stop it. Mara stood closer to the front, notebook in hand, jotting down descriptions as fast as the boxes appeared, occasionally glancing toward Vanessa to gauge her reaction. When the folder marked Mercer West Boundary finally surfaced from beneath a stack of financial ledgers, the room seemed to go still for a moment, as though everyone present understood instinctively that this was the box the entire dispute had been circling. Grant said nothing as Dana pulled it open. Inside was correspondence from the early years of the subdivision's construction. When the original developer had approached the Mercer family with an offer to buy a narrow strip of land for a secondary service road, the family had refused, and the developer had redesigned the entire community layout around that refusal, leaving a note in the file that read in plain-typed language, "Mercer agricultural parcel excluded from association jurisdiction." Beneath that sat something even more damaging. A legal opinion written years earlier warning the board explicitly that it could never use the Mercer field without written permission from the owner. The signature confirming receipt of that warning belonged to Vanessa Crowley, dated and unmistakable at the bottom of the page. The room went quiet as Grant looked directly at her and said she had not made a mistake that she had known. Vanessa offered no denial because there was nothing left to deny. What had always been framed as an innocent confusion over boundaries was now proven in writing to have been a decision made with full knowledge of exactly where the line sat. Mara found something else buried in the same box, old board minutes, showing that Vanessa had once floated the idea of asking Grant for temporary access to the field, then abandoned it, writing that he rarely used the southern Hayfield and likely would not notice. In other words, she had been counting on his absence, believing 3 weeks on the road meant 3 weeks of freedom to do whatever she pleased with his land. Dana kept working through the inventory and pulled out an invoice showing Vanessa had paid for the placement of all 11 pods directly out of the HOA reserve fund without a single vote of board approval behind it. The description she had written on that invoice in her own handwriting read simply storage on HOA-owned parcel. Mara stared at the line for a long moment before saying quietly that this was not what Vanessa had told any of them. Grant had not been the only person Vanessa lied to. She had lied to her own organization on paper in ink that could not be taken back. The insurance carrier's initial inquiry arrived by certified letter within days, addressed jointly to the board and to Vanessa personally, requesting a complete timeline of every decision related to the field. Mara forwarded a copy to Dana without hesitation, a small act that marked the moment she stopped protecting Vanessa's version of events and started protecting the association itself. Grant read through the letter once Dana shared it with him and noted how carefully worded it was, never accusing anyone outright, simply asking questions that only a guilty party would struggle to answer cleanly. He told Dana it reminded him of watching a fence line get surveyed, patient, methodical, and ultimately impossible to argue with once the stakes were in the ground. Word of the discovery spread quickly through the neighborhood, and Vanessa tried to regain control with an emergency newsletter accusing Grant of holding community resources hostage. This time the accusation did not land the way it once might have, because residents were beginning to ask a much more uncomfortable question among themselves: why the HOA had allowed its entire operational record to be stored on someone else's land in the first place. Mara requested an emergency board session which Vanessa refused to authorize, but the bylaws did not require her permission, and 2 other board members joined Mara in calling the meeting anyway. Grant did not turn the situation into a personal campaign against Vanessa when the session convened. Instead, he laid out a clear businesslike proposal. The HOA could retrieve every one of the 11 pods, but only after it formally recognized the surveyed boundary, repaired the fence it had torn down, restored the hayfield to its original condition, covered the resulting damages, paid for the survey work, funded proper transport of the containers off his land, and agreed in writing never to trespass again. Vanessa called the terms extortion the moment she heard them, and Dana calmly set the certified deed on the table in front of her, telling her plainly that this was not extortion, only Grant asking for his land to be returned the way it had been found. Vanessa still refused to budge, convinced Grant would eventually cave rather than let 11 containers sit indefinitely in the middle of his field. Grant let the calendar work against her instead. Autumn was approaching, the hayfield needed restoration, and every additional day the containers sat there added measurable damage and lost use to the running total. Dana documented every single day of delay with careful precision, and Vanessa slowly began to realize that her strategy of stalling was only inflating the very bill she would eventually have to answer for. The HOA's insurance carrier, once informed of the dispute, requested every piece of correspondence related to the boundary, and the legal opinion found inside pod number 9 proved beyond argument that Vanessa had been formally warned years earlier. The insurer began reserving its rights regarding any actions taken outside the scope of her authority, a phrase that meant far more to Vanessa than it did to anyone else in the room. For the first time, she understood that if she had knowingly ignored a written legal warning, the consequences might not simply be absorbed by the HOA on her behalf. As the meeting broke up, Mara pulled Grant aside and told him quietly that Vanessa still believed the worst thing sitting inside those pods was the boundary file. Grant asked if that was not in fact the worst of it, and Mara shook her head, telling him to check the annual meeting boxes next. Grant had assumed once the boundary file surfaced that the worst of the story had already been told, but Mara's warning stayed with him through the following week. He found himself thinking about it while repairing a section of fence near the northern property line, wondering what else Vanessa might have quietly tucked away in a container she never expected anyone outside the HOA to open. The answer arrived faster than he anticipated. Once the preservation order forced the board to review every remaining box rather than cherry-picking which ones to inventory first. The annual meeting boxes were inventoried with the same careful process as everything before them, revealing proxy forms, old ballots, and years of board correspondence. Grant had no personal interest in the internal politics of the association, but Mara certainly did. And she noticed almost immediately that a cluster of proxy forms did not match the list originally presented at the previous election. The discrepancy did not need to be framed as a criminal conspiracy to matter. It was enough on its own to show how completely Vanessa had come to treat HOA authority as something she alone controlled, deciding for herself which homeowners deserved to see which records. Several residents had requested access to those very documents in the past, and had been turned away without explanation, the physical files quietly shuffled off into storage during the supposed clubhouse renovation. Mara finally understood why she had never been able to locate them herself, because Vanessa had kept a tight grip on the physical records the entire time. Now every one of them sat in containers on Grant Mercer's Hayfield, completely outside Vanessa's reach. The more she had tried to use someone else's land as a free, convenient warehouse, the more thoroughly she had placed the very thing she wanted to control beyond her own control. Grant summarized it simply to Mara, telling her Vanessa had brought her own evidence straight to his front door. Mara corrected him gently, saying it was not just evidence, it was the entire HOA. The association's attorney responded to the new discovery by expanding the preservation order across every remaining box, stripping Vanessa of the ability to review any records alone from that point forward. Her composure finally broke in the following meeting when she turned on Grant directly, accusing him of orchestrating the entire collapse himself. Grant answered without raising his voice at all, reminding her that he had been 300 miles away on the day she authorized 11 containers to be delivered onto his deed, a line that left the room completely silent. An emergency membership meeting was scheduled soon after, and Vanessa still believed she retained enough personal loyalty among residents to survive it. Grant did not plan to give a long speech when the night came. He arrived carrying only a printed plat map, a single email, and one invoice, 3 documents that together were more than enough to unravel everything Vanessa had spent weeks trying to construct. Notices went out to every household a full week in advance, and by the time the evening arrived, the parking lot outside the community clubhouse was fuller than anyone could remember. Seeing it, cars lined up along both sides of the access road. Neighbors who had never bothered attending a single HOA meeting filed in early to claim seats, drawn less by curiosity about landscaping budgets than by the rumor that the president herself might be facing removal. Grant arrived quietly, without an entourage or a prepared speech, carrying only a slim folder under one arm, and Dana beside him for support rather than spectacle. The meeting room filled with residents from across the community, more people than had attended any HOA gathering in years. Vanessa took the floor first, standing with the practiced posture of someone certain she still held the room, laying out her version of events one final time. She described Grant as needlessly difficult, the boundary as unclear, the storage arrangement as purely temporary, and every decision she had made as being in the best interest of the community she served. When it was Grant's turn to speak, he did not raise his voice or reach for theatrics. He projected the recorded plat onto the screen first, showing plainly that the Hayfield sat entirely outside HOA jurisdiction, exactly as it always had. Next came the legal opinion proof that Vanessa herself had been formally warned years earlier that using the land without written permission was not allowed. Then came the delivery authorization bearing her own signature, followed finally by the email in which she had promised the HOA would continue using the field regardless of the owner's objection. Grant looked out across the room and told them plainly there had been no honest boundary mistake here at all. There had only ever been a decision made knowingly by the one person standing in front of them insisting otherwise. It was the moment the entire story turned, because Vanessa could no longer blame a careless surveyor, a confused vendor, or a distracted predecessor for what had happened. Mara rose next, confirming publicly that the board had never approved use of the Mercer property, then revealing the reserve fund payment Vanessa had authorized entirely on her own. A ripple of visible anger moved through the crowd as the numbers sank in. Vanessa, losing her composure, completely demanded the meeting be adjourned immediately, but the bylaws allowed for membership motions regardless of what she wanted. One longtime homeowner stood and formally moved for her removal, and Mara seconded it without hesitation. Vanessa shouted that they could not do this to her, and Mara answered, simply holding up the bylaws that actually they could. 2 volunteers from among the residents tallied the ballots by hand while the room waited in near total silence. The only sound the occasional scrape of a chair or a muffled cough somewhere near the back. Vanessa remained standing near the podium the entire time, refusing to sit, as though staying on her feet might somehow influence a count that had already been decided the moment the motion passed. Mara read the final numbers aloud herself, her voice steady and without a trace of satisfaction. Because for her, this had never been about winning against Vanessa personally. The votes were collected and counted in front of everyone in the room, and Vanessa watched the final tally appear, with an expression that told the whole story on its own. She had not merely lost an argument about a fence line. She had lost her position entirely removed in the very meeting where the records she had tried so hard to hide were finally laid out for every member to see. 11 storage pods still sat waiting in Grant's field, and the most expensive part of the story was only beginning to take shape. In the days immediately following the vote, the atmosphere around the association shifted noticeably, residents speaking more openly at gatherings, committee members asking questions they had once been too intimidated to raise. Mara found herself fielding calls from homeowners who wanted to know how something so significant had gone unnoticed for so long, and she answered each one honestly, admitting the board had trusted a single person's word for far too long without asking to see the paperwork behind it. The interim board wasted no time trying to end the dispute properly. Unlike Vanessa, they did not challenge the deed or question the survey for even a moment, accepting both as settled fact and moving straight into negotiations over a formal removal process. Each container was hauled out of the hayfield, using equipment chosen specifically to avoid causing any further damage to the land low-clearance carriers that spread their weight across wide steel plates instead of digging fresh ruts into ground still trying to heal. Colton personally supervised the retrieval, a quiet gesture of accountability neither Grant nor Dana had asked for, but both appreciated, since his crew moved with a caution the original delivery had entirely lacked. Grant stood near the gate and watched them go one after another, counting them off silently as they passed. Each departing container felt like another piece of Vanessa's false authority, being physically dragged off his property. Once the pods were gone, the real accounting began in earnest, covering the torn fence, the deep ruts cut into the soil, the compacted ground, the ruined hay, the cost of the survey, full restoration of the field, attorney fees tied directly to the settlement, corrected transportation charges, and the value of the land Grant had lost the use of during the entire dispute. The final settlement figure landed at $184,700, a number large enough to carry real weight without straining belief. The new board did not have to absorb that figure alone, since the insurer and the transport company each accepted a share of responsibility once the full sequence of events became clear. Dana negotiated the split methodically over several weeks, presenting each party with the same documentation that had already carried the case through the membership meeting, and none of them seriously contested the numbers once they saw how thoroughly everything had been recorded. Grant later told Mara that the hardest part of the entire process had never been proving what happened, only getting anyone in a position of authority to actually look at the deed in the first place. Once that single document was finally taken seriously, he said, everything else had simply fallen into its rightful order on its own. Vanessa's consequences, however, were entirely her own to carry. The board opened an internal review into her conduct, and the insurance carrier began examining in detail her decision to ignore a written legal warning she had personally received years earlier. She was stripped of every remaining committee position she held, and her authority to sign contracts on behalf of the HOA was formally revoked. The board issued a notice, making clear it would not defend decisions made outside proper authorization, once the review confirmed they had never been approved. What hurt Vanessa most was not the money changing hands, but the fact that the story she had repeated for weeks had been dismantled entirely by the very documents she had chosen to place on Grant's land herself. She came to the farm one last time as the final container rolled away down the access road, telling Grant flatly that he had destroyed her reputation over a single field. Grant looked out at the torn earth still waiting to heal, and told her quietly that this was not the case at all. He pointed to the empty space where the containers had stood and said she had stored her own reputation there herself without anyone's help. Vanessa turned and walked away without another word, her car pulling out of the gravel drive for what both of them understood would be the last time. Grant stood there a while longer, listening to the sound of the engine fade down the county road, feeling less triumph than he expected, and more of a quiet, settled relief that the whole ordeal had finally reached its end. Elliot approached moments later, carrying a fresh survey marker, asking Grant if he wanted the boundary line made permanent. Grant looked toward the subdivision in the distance and told him yes, every single foot of it, so that no one standing on either side of that fence could ever again claim confusion about where his land began. Grant spent the following weekend walking the field alone, assessing the damage with the same practiced eye he used every autumn to judge whether a section needed reseeding. The ruts were deep in places, the soil compacted hard enough that water pooled instead of draining, and he knew restoration would take more than a single pass with a tiller. He hired a local contractor recommended by Elliot, a man who specialized in agricultural land recovery, and together they mapped out a plan that would have the field productive again by the following season rather than leaving it scarred for years. Weeks passed and the hayfield slowly returned to health, its grass filling back in over the scars left by heavy tires. A new fence rose exactly along the surveyed boundary line, not built as a monument to anger or as an act of revenge, but simply as a solid, properly anchored barrier marked with legal monuments that could never again be mistaken for a shared corridor. The new HOA board sent Grant a formal written agreement confirming that the Mercer property sat entirely outside its jurisdiction, with no future claim to access, no right to open a road across it, no authority to store equipment there, and no ability to invoke temporary community necessity without the owner's direct consent. Mara was selected as interim president, and she made clear early on that her first priority was not defeating Grant or settling old scores. It was ensuring the association never repeated what Vanessa had done in the first place, and to that end she pushed through a new policy requiring any use of property outside the recorded subdivision boundary to be approved in writing by both the full board and the property owner before a single truck could be dispatched. She also required that every future contract delivery, authorization, and storage agreement be reviewed by the HOA's attorney before signature, closing the exact gap Vanessa had exploited for months without anyone noticing. Grant, for his part, never joined the HOA and never sought any seat on its board. He wanted only what he had always had before the containers appeared, the simple, uninterrupted right to be left alone on his own land. Vanessa sold her house within a few months and left the community entirely, without any dramatic arrest or exaggerated punishment marking her departure. Her downfall carried its own quiet weight instead. She had once believed the title of HOA president could turn her word into ownership, that authority alone could redraw a boundary simply by insisting it existed. In the end, a deed recorded decades earlier proved far stronger than any title she had ever held. Grant drove his tractor across the hayfield one clear afternoon, its grass fully green again after months of healing. He stopped near the exact spot where the 9th pod had once stood, the ground beneath it now indistinguishable from the rest of the field. Elliot had planted the final survey marker near the new fence line days earlier, its cap catching the afternoon light. Grant looked out toward the subdivision, just as an HOA maintenance truck slowed near the old access road, its driver reading the private property sign before turning around and driving away without crossing the line. Vanessa believed 11 storage pods would fold his field quietly into her HOA's control. Instead, she had packed nearly every document proving she was wrong into those containers and delivered them straight onto his deed. Grant never had to steal her records, seize her property, or threaten her board to win. He only had to protect the boundary line she had assumed nobody would ever bother to check. In the end, Vanessa had forgotten the one rule that mattered more than any title or clipboard ever could, that an association can print as many maps as it wants, but it can never redraw a recorded deed.